I thought he came to collect money, but the way Adrian Moretti looked at me that night made it clear he was calculating something far more permanent. The rain had been tapping against our apartment windows for hours, a thin, steady sound that matched the tremor in my hands as I stacked architecture textbooks on the wobbly kitchen table. It was 11:47 p.m. when the knocking started, not polite, not hesitant, but deliberate, like whoever stood outside already owned the door. My father froze halfway through pouring another inch of cheap whiskey, his face draining of color so fast I felt it in my chest. "Clara," he whispered, and I hadn't heard my name sound that fragile since my mom's funeral. The second knock was louder. The third didn't come because the lock clicked open instead, smooth and practiced. 3 men stepped inside, dark suits, rain on their shoulders, silence in their eyes. And then he walked in behind them. Adrian Moretti didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. 6'2", tailored charcoal suit, silver watch catching the dim kitchen light. He stood in our cramped living room like it was a boardroom he had purchased by the square foot. His gaze moved once around the apartment, the peeling paint, the eviction notice taped near the thermostat, the sink full of dishes. Then it landed on my father. $2 million, he said calmly, like he was reading a grocery total. The number sounded unreal in a place where I counted quarters for laundry. My father tried to speak, words tangling in apology and desperation, but Adrian lifted one finger and the room went still. "You signed," he continued, pulling a folded document from his coat. 6 months ago. My stomach dropped. 6 months ago was when my dad said he'd found a solution. I had wanted to believe him. I stepped forward before I could stop myself. "We don't have that kind of money," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. Adrian's eyes shifted to me for the first time. Cold. Assessing. Not cruel. Just certain. I felt seen in a way that made my pulse race. "I'm aware," he replied. My father sank into a chair like the air had been knocked out of him, muttering that he just needed more time. Time. As if time could print $2 million. I swallowed hard. "What happens if he can't pay?" I asked. The question hung there, fragile and sharp. Adrian studied me longer than was comfortable, his gaze tracing the ink smudge on my wrist, the calluses from model building, the stubborn lift of my chin. Something changed in his expression, subtle but real. "Debts don't disappear," he said quietly. "They transfer." The word echoed in my head. Transfer. My father started to protest, but Adrian didn't look at him again. He was still looking at me. "You're Clara Bennett," he said, like it was a fact he'd already verified. "Full scholarship. 2 jobs. No criminal record." My breath caught. How did he know that? He stepped closer, not touching, just close enough that I could smell clean cologne and rain. "He can't pay," Adrian said evenly. "So you will." My father shook his head, whispering my name, but I felt something strange settle over me. Not fear. Not exactly. Clarity. I looked at the eviction notice, at the cracked linoleum, at my father's trembling hands, then back at the man who owned the debt. "If I go," I asked softly, "is it cleared?" Adrian held my gaze for 3 long seconds. "Completely." And that was the moment I realized he hadn't come to take money. He had come to take me. The hallway outside our apartment felt colder than it ever had before, like the building itself knew I was not coming back the same way. I packed in silence while my father sat at the kitchen table, his hands wrapped around a glass he had not lifted. I did not take much. 2 pairs of jeans, 3 sweaters, my sketchbook, and the small wooden ruler my mother used to keep in her sewing kit. I folded everything carefully, like neat edges could make this feel like a choice. Adrian waited near the door, not rushing me, not looking impatient. He checked his watch once, silver catching the yellow kitchen light, then returned his attention to me. "You have 5 minutes," he had said earlier. He did not need to repeat it. When I zipped my duffel bag, the sound felt final. My father stood abruptly. "Clara, do not do this," he said, his voice breaking in the middle. "I will fix it." I looked at him and saw the truth. He would not. He could not. I walked over and pressed the apartment key into his palm. "You already signed something you could not afford," I whispered. "Let me sign this." Adrian opened the door for me himself. Not one of the men in suits. Him. That detail lodged in my mind as we stepped into the rain. The black sedan waiting at the curb looked expensive in a way that did not beg for attention. It simply assumed it deserved space. One of the men took my bag without a word and placed it in the trunk. Adrian gestured toward the back seat. After you. His tone was polite, controlled, like we were leaving a dinner party instead of my entire life. I slid into the leather seat, the interior smelling faintly of cedar and something clean. Adrian entered on the other side. The door shut with a soft, insulated click, sealing out the city noise. As the car pulled away, I watched our apartment building shrink in the side mirror. Third floor. Flickering porch light. The window where I used to sit and sketch the skyline. It looked small. Smaller than the debt that had just swallowed it. Where are we going? I asked. Adrian adjusted his cuff slightly before answering. Somewhere safe. Safe was not the word I would have chosen, but I did not argue. Streetlights slid across his face as we drove, carving his features into light and shadow. He stared forward, jaw set, like he had already calculated the next 10 steps. I studied him instead. No raised voice. No threats. No triumph. If anything, there was tension in the way his fingers rested against his knee, controlled but not relaxed. You could have taken the apartment, I said quietly. You could have taken everything. His gaze shifted to me, sharp but not angry. I do not collect things that depreciate, he replied. I invest in what has value. The words settled between us, heavy and deliberate. I should have felt insulted, reduced. Instead, I felt something else. Curiosity. And what exactly am I? I asked. A slow breath left him, almost thoughtful. That, he said, eyes returning to the road ahead, is what I intend to find out. The city lights grew brighter as we crossed the bridge, Manhattan rising in front of us like a promise or a warning. I tightened my grip on my sketchbook in my lap, realizing that whatever I had just agreed to was no longer about my father's mistake. It was about me stepping into a world that had already decided I belonged in it. The gate opened before I saw the house. Tall iron bars sliding apart without a sound, as if the night itself was making room for him. The car moved slowly up a curved driveway lined with trimmed hedges and subtle ground lights that cast everything in a soft glow. It was not flashy. It was precise, controlled, just like the man sitting beside me. My reflection in the window looked pale under the passing lights, my hair slightly damp from the rain, my eyes wide but steady. I told myself not to look afraid. Fear was leverage. The house came into view gradually, a modern structure of glass and stone rising 3 stories high. Clean lines, sharp angles, every window dark except for a few warm lights on the main floor. It looked less like a home and more like a statement. The car stopped under a covered entrance supported by concrete columns. One of the men stepped out first, opening my door. I hesitated for half a second before placing my hand in his, and stepping onto smooth stone that probably cost more per square foot than our entire apartment. Adrian exited on his side and adjusted his jacket as if this were any other evening. This is temporary, he said, walking toward the front doors. Until we determine the terms. The doors opened before we reached them. Inside, the air smelled faintly of polished wood and something clean, almost sterile. The entryway ceiling stretched at least 20 feet high, a chandelier of thin glass rods hanging like frozen rain. I felt small in that space, like my voice might echo if I spoke too loudly. A woman in her 40s approached, dressed in simple black, her posture calm. "Guest suite is prepared," she said to Adrian. He nodded once. "Make sure she has everything she needs. Not everything I want. Everything I need." The difference settled heavily in my chest. He turned to me then, fully facing me for the first time since we arrived. Under the warm interior lights, his features softened slightly, the hard edges less severe, but still unmistakable. "You are not a prisoner," he said evenly. "There are no locked doors. But there are rules." I crossed my arms more, to steady myself than to appear defiant. "And if I break them?" His gaze held mine without blinking. "You will not want to." It was not a threat. It was certainty. The woman led me down a long hallway lined with abstract art and subtle recessed lighting. My footsteps felt too loud against the hardwood floors. The guest suite was larger than our entire apartment. A king-size bed with crisp white sheets. A private bathroom with marble counters. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city skyline. I set my duffel bag down slowly, turning in a slow circle to take it in. This was not a cage. It was something more confusing. I walked to the window and pressed my palm against the cool glass. Manhattan stretched out below, glittering and distant. Somewhere across that river was my father, probably still sitting at that table. I swallowed hard. A soft knock sounded behind me. I turned to find Adrian standing in the doorway, not stepping inside. "You asked what you are," he said quietly. "You are collateral. For now." My fingers tightened against the glass. "And when the debt is settled?" He studied me for a long moment, something unreadable flickering in his eyes. "That depends," he replied, "on whether you still owe me anything at all." I did not sleep that night. The bed was too large, the sheets too clean, the silence too complete. I lay on my back staring at the ceiling, tracing the faint lines of recessed lighting as if they were blueprints I needed to memorize. Every sound felt amplified in the stillness, the distant hum of climate control, the faint echo of footsteps somewhere down the hall. This house did not creak. It did not settle. It existed exactly as designed. Around 3 in the morning, I gave up pretending to rest and slipped out of bed. The hardwood floors were cool beneath my bare feet as I crossed to the window. The skyline shimmered under a dark sky, the river reflecting city lights like broken glass. Somewhere in that maze of concrete and steel, my old life continued without me. I wrapped my arms around myself and tried to measure what I had just traded. At 8 sharp, there was a soft knock. Not insistent, not commanding. "Breakfast is ready," the same woman from earlier said through the door. I showered quickly, changed into one of my sweaters, and followed the scent of coffee down the hallway. The kitchen was expansive and bright, sunlight pouring through floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked a manicured lawn stretching at least 50 yards before meeting the property line. Adrian stood at the island, sleeves rolled neatly to his forearms, reading something on a tablet. He looked up as I entered, his expression unreadable but attentive. "You slept?" he asked. It sounded almost polite. "Enough," I replied, taking a seat across from him. A plate had already been set in front of me, eggs, fruit, toast arranged with quiet precision. I hesitated before touching anything. "It is not poisoned," he said dryly, one brow lifting slightly. I met his gaze. I was thinking more about leverage. A faint flicker of something passed through his eyes. Approval, maybe. "You are observant," he said. "That is useful." I took a sip of coffee. It was rich and strong, nothing like the discount brand we bought on sale. "What exactly are your rules?" I asked. He set the tablet down slowly, folding his hands on the counter. "You do not leave the property without permission. You do not access areas that are restricted. You do not involve yourself in business that does not concern you." His tone remained calm, but each sentence landed with weight. "And what does concern me?" I asked. He studied me as if weighing the answer. "Your future." The word startled me more than any threat could have. "I am collateral," I reminded him. "Temporary." "Everything is temporary," he replied. "The question is what you make of it." I leaned back slightly, watching him. "You said you invest in value. What return are you expecting?" For a moment, silence stretched between us, charged but not hostile. Adrian walked around the island, stopping a few feet from where I sat. Close enough to feel his presence, not close enough to intimidate. "You have discipline," he said quietly. "You stayed standing last night when most people would have collapsed." His eyes held mine steadily. I do not mistake resilience for weakness. My pulse quickened despite myself. "And if I decide not to cooperate?" I asked. He did not raise his voice. He did not step closer. "Then you waste potential," he said simply. "And I do not tolerate waste." I looked down at my hands resting on the marble surface, steady despite the uncertainty swirling inside me. This was not a cage. It was a test. And for the first time since the door had opened in my apartment, I realized something unsettling. He was not just evaluating my worth. He was offering me a choice I had never been given before. I spent the rest of the morning walking the length of the property like I was measuring it for a project. 50 yards of manicured lawn, a stone patio overlooking the river, security cameras positioned with quiet precision at each corner of the house. Nothing felt accidental. Even the landscaping looked intentional, trimmed into clean lines that mirrored the architecture. Control was everywhere. And somehow, I was part of the design now. I found Adrian in a glass-walled office on the second floor, sunlight cutting across a long steel desk covered in neatly arranged documents. He did not look surprised to see me. "Exploring?" he asked without looking up. "Researching," I replied. He set his pen down slowly and leaned back in his chair. "And what have you concluded?" I stepped farther into the room, noting the absence of clutter, the framed city map behind him marked with small, precise pins. You do not do anything without purpose, I said. Including me. His gaze sharpened slightly. Not offended. Interested. Correct, he said. I folded my arms, forcing myself to hold eye contact. Then stopped speaking in metaphors. What is the actual plan? Silence settled between us, heavy but not hostile. Adrian stood and walked toward the window, hands clasped behind his back. The city stretched out below like a chessboard. Your father signed an agreement he did not understand, he said evenly. But the money was never the only asset involved. My stomach tightened. What does that mean? He turned toward me fully. 6 months ago, he agreed to transfer development rights on a parcel of land he owns in Queens. A neglected industrial lot that most people consider worthless. I blinked. We do not own land. You do, he corrected calmly. Your mother did. It passed to him when she died. He leveraged it without informing you. The words felt like cold water. My mother's land. The small property she used to talk about redeveloping into affordable housing one day. I swallowed hard. And you want it? Adrian shook his head once. I already have the legal leverage to take it. My pulse quickened. Then why am I here? He stepped closer, stopping a few feet away. Because I do not want the land, he said quietly. I want the project. I stared at him. What project? The one your mother sketched for years, he replied. Mixed-use housing. Community space. Sustainable design. My breath caught. I had those sketches. I had grown up studying them. How do you know about that? His expression did not change. I know everything tied to what I acquire. Acquire. The word should have angered me. Instead, something else sparked beneath my ribs. Possibility. You said you invest in value. I whispered. Adrian nodded once. I need someone who understands the vision. Someone who will not cut corners. Someone who does not scare easily. His eyes locked onto mine. You. The room felt smaller suddenly, the air thinner. You brought me here to design it. I asked. To decide if you are capable, he corrected. If you succeed, the debt is settled. The land remains in your family's name. You oversee the build. My heart pounded so loudly I was certain he could hear it. This was not captivity. It was leverage wrapped in opportunity. And if I fail? I asked quietly. Adrian's voice remained steady. Then you prove I miscalculated. I held his gaze, steadying my breathing. For the first time since that knock on the door, I saw the outline of something larger than fear. He did not come to collect money. He came to test whether I was worth more than it. He gave me 48 hours. That was all. 48 hours to review architectural surveys, zoning codes, environmental impact reports, and financial projections that would intimidate most licensed developers. He did not say it was a test again, but the clock was implied in the way he slid a leather folder across the glass desk and stepped back without another word. I carried the folder to the guest's suite like it weighed more than paper. Inside were copies of my mother's original sketches, scanned and preserved with a care that startled me. The curved facade she had designed to soften the industrial block. The rooftop garden concept meant to provide fresh produce for residents. My throat tightened. He had not just researched the land. He had studied her. I spread everything. Across the large desk near the window, sunlight spilling over blueprints and market analyses. Numbers did not scare me. They made sense. Steel cost per square foot. Concrete supply chains. Estimated construction timelines measured in months instead of dreams. What unsettled me was how thorough his preparation had been. Every permit pathway highlighted. Every potential obstacle annotated. It was as if he had been waiting for someone capable of stepping into this role. Around noon, there was a quiet knock. Adrian entered without crossing fully into the room, respecting a boundary I had not asked for, but noticed anyway. You have questions, he said. Not asked. Stated. I nodded once. The soil report indicates contamination in the southwest corner. I replied, holding up a page. Remediation will add at least 6 months and several $100,000. He walked in then, closing the distance to stand beside the desk. Close enough to see the faint crease between his brows as he looked at the page. It will, he agreed calmly. But long-term value increases with clean certification. I glanced at him. Most investors would cut that corner. His eyes met mine steadily. I am not most investors. The simplicity of the statement sent a quiet shiver through me. He was not chasing fast profit. He was building legacy. I shifted to another document. The zoning board will resist mixed-income housing at that density. They will, he acknowledged. Unless presented with economic impact projections that make refusal politically inconvenient. He said it like a chess move already calculated. I studied him in profile, the controlled posture, the deliberate tone. He was not offering help. He was evaluating how quickly I could think alongside him. You already have strategies for every obstacle, I said slowly. Then why involve me at all? Adrian's gaze lingered on the sketches of my mother's curved facade. Because this was never my vision, he answered quietly. It was hers. Silence settled between us, heavier than before, but not uncomfortable. I realized then that this project was not leverage against my father. It was leverage against something else inside him. You could hire any architect in Manhattan, I said. With awards. Experience. He turned toward me fully. Awards do not guarantee integrity, he replied. And experience does not guarantee courage. His eyes softened just slightly. You stayed. You asked questions. You did not beg. My pulse quickened again, not from fear, but from recognition. He saw strength in me before I had fully claimed it myself. I looked back down at the plans, tracing my mother's handwriting along the margins. If I do this, I said quietly, it is not for the debt. Adrian's expression did not change, but something in the air shifted. I would not expect it to be, he said. In that moment, I understood something dangerous and powerful at the same time. The debt had been the door. The project was the real contract. And for the first time since stepping into his world, I felt like I was no longer being collected. I was being chosen. The second night, I stopped feeling like a guest and started feeling like a partner in something dangerous and deliberate. 48 hours had nearly passed, and I had not left the desk except to refill coffee and clear my head on the balcony. I rewrote cost projections, adjusted density ratios, redesigned the Southwest remediation plan to phase construction instead of delaying it entirely. If contamination was isolated correctly, we could begin foundation work on the clean half of the lot within 4 months instead of waiting 6. It was aggressive, but it was possible. Adrian returned just after sunset, jacket draped over his arm, the faint scent of cold air following him inside. He did not ask if I had finished. He walked straight to the desk and studied the spread of marked-up pages. Red ink, notes in the margins, alternative supplier lists. He stood there for a long time, silent, absorbing. You phased the remediation, he said finally. Not a question. I nodded. We divide the lot into 2 zones. Certified clean section moves first. Investors see visible progress within 120 days. Momentum reduces resistance. He glanced at me then, and something in his eyes sharpened. And the cost increase. Offset by pre-leasing community retail space. I replied. Local businesses with long-term contracts. It stabilizes projected cash flow. The corner of his mouth shifted slightly. Not a smile. Recognition. You think long-term, he said quietly. That is rare. I felt heat rise in my chest. Not from pride, but from being understood. You said this was not about quick profit, I reminded him. He walked around the desk slowly, stopping across from me. The city lights behind him cast his outline in shadow, turning him into a silhouette of control and calculation. If this succeeds, he said, it will redefine that neighborhood. I met his gaze steadily. If it succeeds, it will honor my mother. Silence filled the room again, but this time it felt shared rather than tense. Adrian rested one hand on the edge of the desk, leaning slightly forward. Close enough to make the air between us feel charged, but not crossing the invisible line we both seemed aware of. You understand what attaching your name to this means, he said. There will be scrutiny. I held his gaze. There always is when something valuable is being built. His eyes lingered on me longer than usual, as if weighing more than just architectural competence. You are not afraid of association, he observed. I am afraid of wasting opportunity, I replied. The words surprised even me. He straightened slowly, nodding once as if a private conclusion had been reached. Then we proceed, he said. Just like that. No ceremony. No dramatic declaration. The decision felt heavier because of its simplicity. He extended a document toward me, not a contract, but an official proposal draft with my name listed as project lead. My breath caught when I saw it. Clara Bennett. Not collateral. Not temporary. Lead. This is conditional, he added evenly. Performance determines permanence. I took the paper from his hand, our fingers brushing briefly in the exchange. The contact was steady, Intentional, not accidental. You still think this is a test? I said softly. His gaze held mine, unreadable but intense. Everything worth building is, he replied. And in that moment, I realized the project was no longer the only thing under construction. Trust was being drafted in quiet increments. Respect was being poured like foundation. And somewhere between leverage and opportunity, something else had begun to take shape. Not possession, not obligation. Something far more dangerous. Choice. The morning we presented the revised proposal to his advisory board, I understood what scrutiny actually meant. The conference room was nothing like the warmth of the guest suite or the quiet focus of his office. It was glass on three sides, suspended above the city like a statement of dominance. 5 men and 1 woman sat along the elongated table, each dressed in muted luxury, each carrying the kind of silence that measured people before. Trusting them. Adrian did not introduce me with exaggeration. Clara Bennett, project lead, he said simply, then took his seat at the head of the table. No explanation, no apology, just certainty. I felt every pair of eyes shift toward me, assessing age, posture, confidence. I placed my mother's revised renderings on the screen behind me and began. I did not rush. I did not soften the numbers. I spoke in square footage, projected yield percentages, phased remediation schedules, and long-term neighborhood valuation models. I showed them how initial contamination costs could be absorbed within 18 months through stabilized retail contracts and community tax incentives. I did not speak about sentiment. I spoke about sustainability. When one of them questioned the timeline, suggesting it was optimistic, I held his gaze and walked him through the contingency buffers I had built into the model. When another asked why mixed-income housing should be prioritized over luxury units, I explained how diversified occupancy reduced volatility in downturn markets. I felt Adrian's eyes on me more than anyone else's, not protective, not possessive, but attentive, measuring whether I faltered. I did not. After 45 minutes, the room fell quiet. Papers shifted. Subtle nods were exchanged. The woman at the far end of the table leaned forward slightly. "You believe in this," she said. It was not a question. I let a single breath steady my voice. "Yes," I answered. "Not because it is profitable, because it is durable." Silence again. Then Adrian stood. "We proceed," he said. No vote. No dramatic pause. Just decision. The others did not argue. They gathered their documents and filed out one by one, casting me final looks that no longer felt dismissive. When the door closed, the room seemed larger. I exhaled slowly, tension leaving my shoulders all at once. Adrian remained standing at the head of the table, hands resting lightly against the polished surface. "You did not hesitate," he said quietly. I turned toward him, adrenaline still humming in my veins. "You said performance determines permanence." A faint shift touched his expression, something almost like approval, but deeper. "You understand power," he replied. "It is not loud. It is consistent." I met his gaze without flinching. "And what happens now?" He walked around the table, stopping close enough that I could see the reflection of the city in his eyes. "Now," he said, evenly, "your name moves from conditional to official." My pulse quickened. Not from fear. From gravity. This was no longer a temporary arrangement tied to my father's mistake. It was alignment. He extended his hand, not as a command, not as a claim, but as acknowledgement. I placed my hand in his, steady and deliberate. The handshake was firm, balanced, equal. And in that moment, I realized something had shifted completely. I had not been taken. I had stepped forward, and he had stepped back just enough to let me. Construction began 90 days later. I stood at the edge of the Queen's lot wearing a hard hat that still felt unfamiliar, steel-toe boots planted on soil that had once existed only in my mother's drawings. The southwest corner was fenced off for remediation, heavy equipment positioned with careful precision. The clean half of the property was already marked with bright survey flags outlining the future foundation. 120 days. I had promised visible progress. Now the concrete trucks were proof. The air smelled like wet earth and diesel, sharp and honest. Adrian stood a few feet away speaking quietly with the site manager, his posture relaxed but attentive. Even here, in the open air, people shifted when he moved. Authority followed him without effort. When he finished, he walked toward me, stopping at my side rather than in front of me. It was subtle, but I noticed. We faced the lot together. "You kept the timeline," he said evenly. So far, I replied, scanning the crew as they prepared to pour the first footing. Weather and supply chains can still complicate everything. He glanced at me. You plan for complications. I did not look at him. I plan because I have seen what happens when people do not. The memory of my father's kitchen table flickered briefly in my mind. Adrian did not respond immediately. Instead, he studied the construction layout, eyes tracing the grid lines as if he could already see the finished structure rising. Your name is on the permits, he said quietly. You understand that? I nodded. If something fails, it is on me. If it succeeds, he corrected calmly, it is also on you. The first pour began, gray concrete flowing into the forms with steady force. I felt something tighten in my chest watching it settle into place. This was no longer theory, no longer leverage. It was tangible, real. A foundation measured in inches and integrity. A sleek black car slowed near the entrance to the site, unfamiliar. I noticed the driver's window roll down slightly, someone inside observing longer than necessary. My shoulders stiffened. Adrian's gaze followed mine, sharp and assessing. Not all attention is supportive, he said quietly. I assumed that. He shifted closer, lowering his voice without urgency. This project changes more than skyline. It alters influence. I understood then that success would not be welcomed by everyone connected to his world. I exhaled slowly. Then we build it correctly the first time. A faint curve touched his mouth, subtle but genuine. You speak like you already belong here. I turned to face him fully. I do belong here, I said, not defiantly, but with clarity. This was my mother's land. His eyes held mine, and for a moment the noise of machinery faded into background hum. Then protect it, he replied softly. The concrete settled. The crew adjusted the forms. The black car at the gate drove away without stopping. I watched until it disappeared from view, a quiet reminder that progress attracts attention, good and otherwise. Adrian stepped back slightly, giving me space as the site manager approached with questions about the next phase. I answered without hesitation. When I finished, I felt his presence still behind me, steady and unwavering. Not directing, not controlling, standing guard without saying it aloud. And for the first time since the night I left my apartment, I realized the most powerful shift had not been in contracts or blueprints. It was in the way he no longer stood ahead of me. He stood beside me. By the time the steel beams began to rise, the project had a rhythm of its own. Mornings started at the site, afternoons in meetings, evenings reviewing contracts under the warm light of the office that no longer felt unfamiliar. I had learned the language of contractors and city inspectors, the cadence of negotiation, the art of standing firm without raising my voice. Adrian watched it all without interfering. He stepped in only when necessary, and even then, he did not overshadow. He reinforced. The first public announcement came 6 months after ground was broken. A press conference held at the edge of the property, a temporary platform set up against the backdrop of emerging structure. Banners displayed renderings of what would soon replace empty industrial land. I stood behind the microphone with sunlight in my eyes and cameras pointed in my direction. My name was introduced without qualifiers. Not as someone's daughter. Not as collateral. As project lead. I spoke about sustainable design, about long-term investment in community stability, about honoring the history of the neighborhood rather than erasing it. I did not mention the night that had started all of this. That belonged to a different chapter. When questions turned sharper, probing into Adrian's involvement, I answered calmly. Investment follows vision, I said. And vision requires commitment. I did not defend him. I did not distance myself either. I stood in alignment. After the conference, as reporters dispersed and construction noise resumed its steady pulse, Adrian approached from behind the temporary staging area. You handled that well, he said quietly. They were looking for cracks. I removed the microphone clip from my collar and handed it to an assistant. They did not find any, I replied. He studied me for a moment, expression thoughtful rather than guarded. You have changed the narrative, he said. From speculation to structure. I let out a slow breath. Structure lasts longer. He stepped closer, lowering his voice. So does loyalty. The words settled between us, heavier than before. This was no longer about leverage or land or contracts. It was about trust built in incremental layers, reinforced by action instead of promises. That evening, we returned to the house overlooking the river. The skyline reflected against the glass walls as twilight deepened. I stood on the balcony, watching lights flicker on across Manhattan, each window representing a life unfolding independently of ours. Adrian joined me without speaking, resting his hands lightly against the railing. For a long moment, we simply looked out at the city that had tested both of us in different ways. "Your father called today," he said finally. My breath paused. "Is he all right?" "He is sober," Adrian replied, "and asking about the project." Relief moved quietly through me. "What did you tell him?" Adrian's gaze remained on the skyline. "That his daughter does not require saving." I turned toward him slowly. In the fading light, his features were softer, less defined by shadow. "You did not have to say that," I said. He met my eyes steadily. "Yes," he replied. "I did." And in that moment, I understood that the greatest shift had not been in ownership or control. It had been in recognition. He no longer saw me as leverage. He saw me as equal. And I no longer stood beside him because of a debt. I stood there because I chose to remain. The first crack did not come from the building. It came from the board. 2 weeks after the press conference, I was called into a private meeting I had not scheduled. Not the full advisory group. Just 2 senior investors and 1 legal consultant I had seen before but never spoken to directly. Adrian was not in the room when I arrived. That was deliberate. The glass walls felt colder that afternoon, the city below muted by a gray sky threatening rain. I sat down without waiting to be invited. "There are concerns," one of the investors began, folding his hands neatly on the table. "About accelerated expansion." I kept my voice steady. Expansion was approved unanimously. The legal consultant slid a document toward me. "Unanimous support can evolve." I glanced at the paper. It proposed reallocating a portion of the mixed income units to higher margin luxury space. Subtle, strategic, profitable. It also dismantled the balance I had fought to design. "This alters the foundation agreement," I said evenly. The zoning incentives were contingent on community allocation percentages. The second investor leaned forward slightly. "Zoning boards can be persuaded." The implication hung in the air, not spoken but understood. I felt something tighten in my chest, not fear but clarity. This was the real test. Not competence. Integrity. "We do not need persuasion," I replied calmly. "We need compliance. If we shift now, we compromise long-term valuation and public trust." Silence followed. The consultant's pen tapped once against the table. "You are new to this scale of negotiation," he said. "There are realities." I met his gaze without flinching. "There are principles." The door opened behind me. Adrian entered quietly, no raised voice, no dramatic interruption. He took a seat at the head of the table and looked at the document in front of me. "Explain," he said simply. The first investor outlined the proposal with careful language, emphasizing return percentages and risk mitigation. Adrian listened without interruption, expression unreadable. When they finished, he turned his attention to me. "Your assessment?" The room held its breath. This was not a private conversation anymore. I felt the weight of it, but my voice did not waver. "Short-term gains. Long-term instability. It fractures the original vision and jeopardizes regulatory goodwill." Adrian held my gaze for a long moment. "And your recommendation?" "Rejected." The word landed cleanly between us. No apology. No hesitation. Silence stretched. The investors shifted slightly, waiting for him to override me. Instead, Adrian closed the document and slid it back across the table. "We do not revise commitments mid-structure," he said evenly. "If the margins concern you, reconsider your stake." The firmness in his tone was not loud. It was final. The meeting ended within minutes. When the room emptied, I remained seated, heart still pounding beneath controlled breathing. Adrian stayed as well. "They were testing you," he said quietly. I let out a slow breath. "I know." He studied me with that same measured intensity he had worn the first night we met. "And?" he asked. I stood, gathering my notes. "I do not build things I am not willing to defend." A faint shift crossed his expression, something deeper than approval. "Respect." "Neither do I," he replied. And in that moment, I understood that the strongest foundations were not poured in concrete. They were set in conviction. The steel reached its highest point in early spring. From the street, the structure no longer looked like possibility. It looked inevitable. Glass panels were being installed along the curved facade my mother had once drawn on thin tracing paper at our kitchen table. I stood across the street that morning, wind catching the edge of my coat, watching workers secure the final beam into place. The neighborhood had started to change around it. A coffee shop reopened on the corner. A hardware store repainted its sign. Progress did not whisper. It signaled. Adrian joined me without announcement, hands in the pockets of his dark coat, gaze steady on the rising building. They stopped questioning, he said quietly. I knew who he meant. Investors. Consultants. The ones who had tested my resolve. Results reduced doubt, I replied. He glanced at me. And consistency silences opposition. The words felt layered. Not just about construction. About us. That afternoon we walked through the nearly completed lobby, sunlight pouring through 30-foot glass walls onto polished concrete floors. The space smelled like new paint and fresh wood. I ran my fingers lightly along the reception desk, feeling the grain beneath the finish. It is exactly as she imagined, I said softly. Adrian stood a few feet away, studying the lines, the proportions, the way light moved through the open atrium. No, he said after a moment. It is more. I turned toward him. How? His expression was calm but certain. Because you built it with resistance, he replied. She built it with hope. The distinction settled deep. Hope dreams. Resistance defends. Together, they endure. My phone vibrated in my pocket. A message from my father. He was outside. I stepped through the temporary entrance and saw him standing near the sidewalk, hands shoved awkwardly into his jacket pockets. He looked smaller than I remembered, but clearer, present, sober. When his eyes lifted to the building, they filled with something I had not seen in years. Pride. You did this, he said quietly as I approached. I shook my head. We did. He nodded once, glancing toward Adrian, who remained near the entrance but did not intrude. He gave you the chance, my father said. I looked back at the structure rising against the skyline. He gave me the door. I answered. I walked through it. When I returned inside, Adrian was waiting near the center of the lobby. Not commanding, not distant, simply there. Your father understands now, he said. It was not a question. I met his gaze steadily. So do I. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The building hummed with quiet activity around us, finishing touches, final inspections, last details before opening. The project had begun as leverage, then opportunity, then alignment. Now it stood as proof. Not of ownership, not of debt, but of transformation. Adrian stepped closer, stopping within the space that had long ago stopped feeling like a boundary. When this opens, he said evenly, the obligation is cleared. I searched his expression carefully. And after that, his eyes did not waver. After that, he replied, we choose. And for the first time since that knock on my old apartment door, I understood something with absolute clarity. Power taken is temporary. Power earned is permanent. And what stood between us now was not contract. It was decision. The opening night did not feel loud. It felt earned. The lobby lights glowed warm against the glass facade, reflecting the city skyline like a quiet acknowledgement. Residents moved through the entrance carrying small boxes, laughter echoing softly beneath the 30-foot atrium ceiling. Children traced their hands along the curved walls. A local bakery set up near the corner retail space, the scent of fresh bread mixing with new paint and polished wood. I stood near the center of it all, not hidden, not overshadowed, simply present. My name was engraved on a modest metal plaque near the reception desk. Project Lead, Clara Bennett. No footnotes. No disclaimers. My father stood beside me, hands steady, eyes clear. Your mother would have stayed up all night walking these halls, he said quietly. I swallowed the emotion rising in my throat. She is here, I replied, glancing up at the design that had once existed only in her sketches. Across the room, Adrian spoke with city officials and community leaders, his posture composed, voice calm, movements measured. He did not command attention. He held it. When his eyes met mine from across the lobby, there was no distance left between obligation and intention. Later, when the crowd thinned and the noise softened to a gentle hum, I stepped outside onto the sidewalk. The building rose above me, steel and glass and conviction shaped into permanence. Footsteps approached behind me, unhurried. Adrian stopped at my side, hands resting lightly in his coat pockets. It is finished, he said quietly. I shook my head slightly. It is beginning. A faint smile touched his expression, subtle but real. The obligation is cleared, he reminded me. The words felt different now. Lighter. I turned to face him fully. Then what remains? He did not hesitate. Choice. The city moved around us, taxis passing, streetlights flickering on as dusk settled. No contracts. No leverage. No tests. Just two people standing at the edge of something undefined. I stayed because I believed in the project, I said slowly. But I am still here because I believe in the partnership. His gaze held mine, steady and unguarded in a way I had never seen before. You were never property, he said evenly. You were potential. The honesty in his voice did not feel strategic. It felt earned. I let out a slow breath, the weight of months shifting into something steadier. Then I choose to stay, I said. Not as collateral, not as debt, as equal. Adrian nodded once, as if sealing something more significant than any contract we had signed. Then we build again, he replied. I looked back at the building, its lights reflecting in the river beyond, a structure born from resistance and hope intertwined. The night we first met, I thought I was being taken. I did not understand that I was being invited. He ruled the city with precision. I learned to rule my fear with conviction. And somewhere between power and purpose, we found something neither of us had planned. Not ownership, not obligation, partnership. And that, more than any contract, was permanent.